My name is Clementine Foster, and I killed my own parents while they slept, shot them both dead in their beds 20 years ago, and I don't regret it one bit. I'm 69 years old now, been out of the state penitentiary for just a few months, and most folks around here still cross the street when they see me coming. They whisper behind their hands at the grocery store, point me out to their children like I'm some kind of monster. But what they don't know, what nobody knows, is that I didn't kill two innocent old people that night. I killed two demons who were destroying the most precious thing in my world. You see, people look at me and see a grandmother who committed the unthinkable. They see a woman who broke the most sacred commandment, who turned against her own blood. What they can't see is that sometimes love makes you do things that look like hate to the outside world. Sometimes protecting what matters most means becoming the villain in everyone else's story. I've carried this truth for 20 long years, through sleepless nights in a cold cell, through the shame and the whispers, through losing everything I ever held dear except for one thing, the knowledge that I saved her, that I saved my grandbaby from something worse than death itself. Lord knows I ain't got much time left on this earth, and before I meet my maker, I need to tell you what really happened that night in 2004. I need you to understand why a God-fearing woman like me picked up a gun and did what the law calls murder, but what my heart still calls salvation. This story's been eating at me like cancer, and maybe if I tell it right, you'll see that monsters don't always look like the boogeyman. Sometimes they look like your grandpa reading bedtime stories, like your grandma braiding your hair. So settle in with me, won't you? Walk with me through this memory that's been my companion in the darkest hours. Help me carry this burden I've been shouldering alone, because Lord knows I could use some company on this journey back to that terrible, necessary night. You know, life has a funny way of fooling you into thinking you're safe. Back in 2004, I was living what most folks would call a blessed life in Havenwood, Kansas. It's one of those towns where everybody knows everybody, where the church bells still ring every Sunday morning, and you can smell Mrs. Patterson's apple pie cooling on her windowsill 3 houses down. Population maybe 15,000 on a good day. The kind of place where leaving your doors unlocked wasn't foolish, just neighborly. I was 49 then, working as a receptionist down at Morrison's lumber mill, answering phones and keeping track of deliveries. Nothing fancy, mind you, but it paid the bills and kept me busy. My little house on Elm Street had been in our family for generations. White clapboard siding, wraparound porch, and a garden where my mama used to grow the prettiest roses you ever did see. It was home to more than just me, though. My parents, Orville and Loretta, had moved in after Daddy's stroke a few years back. At 73 and 71, they needed looking after, and I was happy to do it. See, I'd always been the dutiful daughter. Never married, came close once with a boy named Tommy. But the war took him before we could say our vows. So it was just me and my folks, and later my daughter Birdie when she blessed us with her presence. Birdie was 27 by then, but Lord help me, that girl was wrestling with demons I couldn't understand. Drugs had gotten their claws in her deep, pulling her away from us for weeks at a time, leaving behind the one pure light in all our lives, my grandbaby, Willa. 7 years old that little angel was, with hair like spun gold and eyes blue as a summer sky. When Birdie would disappear on one of her benders, Willa would curl up in my lap and ask when Mama was coming home, and I'd just hold her tight and tell her Mama was sick, but she'd be back soon. Truth was, I didn't know if Birdie would ever get clean, but I knew that little girl needed stability, needed love, needed to feel safe in this uncertain world, and safe she was, or so I thought. My parents dotted on Willa something fierce. Daddy would call her our little sunshine and spend hours teaching her to play checkers on the front porch. Mama would braid her hair every morning before school, weaving little ribbons through those golden strands like she was preparing a princess for court. They seemed like the perfect grandparents, the kind you read about in storybooks. But you know what they say about still waters running deep. Sometimes the prettiest surface hides the darkest depths. I started noticing little things first. Things that didn't make sense, but didn't seem alarming either. Willa began wetting the bed again, something she hadn't done since she was 4. She'd wake up screaming from nightmares she couldn't or wouldn't describe, just sobbing into my shoulder about bad dreams and scary games. The doctor said it was probably stress from her mama being gone so much that children process abandonment in mysterious ways. Then came the mornings when she'd cling to my skirt like her life depended on it, begging me not to leave for work. "Please don't go, Grandma Clementine," she'd whisper with tears in those blue eyes. "Please stay home with me today." It broke my heart, but I had to work. Bills don't pay themselves, and I figured she was just going through a phase, missing her mama, something terrible. I trusted my parents with her. Why wouldn't I? They'd raised me, hadn't they? They'd been pillars of the community, respected members of First Baptist Church for over 30 years. Daddy had worked at the grain elevator until his retirement, and Mama had been the church pianist until arthritis claimed her fingers. They were good people, God-fearing people, or so I thought. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed, the red flags I explained away because the truth was too horrible to imagine. But that's the thing about evil. It knows how to wear a mask. It knows how to smile and speak sweetly and make you believe everything's just fine, right up until the moment you realize you've been living with the devil himself. And it was about to show me just how deep that darkness could go. The relationship I had with my parents was built on a foundation I thought was solid as the limestone beneath our Kansas soil. 49 years of believing they were good people, decent people, who'd raised me with firm hands and Christian values. But relationships, especially family ones, are like old houses. Sometimes the rot starts in places you can't see, eating away at the support beams until one day the whole thing comes crashing down. Daddy had always been the strong, silent type. After his stroke, he moved slower, but his mind stayed sharp as a tack. He'd sit in his recliner by the window, watching the world go by, and when Willa would climb up on his lap, his whole face would light up like Christmas morning. I remember the smell of his aftershave, Old Spice, mixing with the scent of the peppermints he always kept in his shirt pocket for her. He had this way of speaking to her, real soft and gentle, like she was made of spun glass that might break if he raised his voice. Mama was different, more talkative, always bustling around the kitchen or fussing over one thing or another. Her hands were never still, always knitting or cooking or cleaning something that probably didn't need cleaning. She'd spent 45 years making that house into a home, and every corner held some memory of her touch. The way she'd hum while she worked, old hymns mostly, created this atmosphere of peace that made everyone feel welcome. When Willa was with them, I'd see glimpses of who they used to be when I was small. Daddy telling stories about his days at the grain elevator, making her giggle with his exaggerated voices for all the characters. Mama teaching her to roll out biscuit dough, flour dusting both their aprons as they worked side by side at the kitchen counter. These were the moments that made me grateful we all lived under one roof, grateful that my baby girl had such loving grandparents to fill in the gaps left by Bertie's absence. I'd come home from work and find them all in the living room together, Daddy reading to Willa from one of those little golden books, Mama mending clothes while she listened. The picture of domestic tranquility, 3 generations bound by love and shared history. It warmed my heart something fierce, made me believe that despite all the troubles with Bertie, we were doing right by this precious child. But there were moments, fleeting as summer lightning, when something felt off. I'd catch Daddy looking at Willa in a way that made my stomach flutter with unease, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Or I'd walk into a room, and the conversation would stop just a beat too long, like they'd been talking about something they didn't want me to hear. Mama would get this nervous energy sometimes, chattering about nothing in particular, when usually she was comfortable with silence. I pushed those feelings down, told myself I was being paranoid. These were my parents, the people who'd taught me right from wrong, who dragged me to church every Sunday until I was old enough to drive myself. They'd never laid a harmful hand on me growing up. Strict, yes, but never cruel. Why would my mind even wander to dark places when there was no evidence of anything but love in our home? The trust I had in them ran deeper than blood. It was woven into every childhood memory, every scraped knee they'd bandaged, every bedtime prayer they'd heard. When you've spent nearly 50 years believing someone is good, it becomes as natural as breathing. You don't question it any more than you question whether the sun will rise tomorrow. But trust, I learned, can be the most dangerous thing in the world when it's misplaced. It can blind you to truths that are staring you right in the face, make you explain away evidence that should send you running. Trust can make you an accomplice to horrors you'd die before allowing, simply because you refuse to believe the unbelievable. And the thing about predators, the real ones, not the strangers in dark alleys that we warn our children about, is that they know exactly how to use that trust. They count on it. They build their whole operation around the fact that the people who should be protecting the innocent are the same ones who'll make excuses for the inexcusable, who'll see what they want to see instead of what's really there. I was about to learn that the people I trusted most in this world had been living a lie for God knows how long, and that my precious Willa had been paying the price for my blindness. The first crack in my perfect family picture came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I remember because the leaves were just starting to turn, painting our little street in shades of gold and crimson that reminded me why I'd never wanted to leave Havenwood. I was running late for work. The coffee pot had decided to give up the ghost, and I'd spent 20 minutes trying to coax life back into it before giving up and heading to the kitchen to make instant. Willa was supposed to be getting ready for school, but when I went to check on her, I found her sitting on the edge of her bed, still in her nightgown, staring at nothing. Her little face was pale as fresh snow, and she had that hollow look children get when they're carrying something too heavy for their small souls. I sat down beside her, smoothing her hair away from her face. It felt damp with sweat, despite the cool morning air drifting through her window. When I asked what was wrong, she just shook her head and climbed into my lap like she used to do when she was even smaller. But this wasn't the comfortable snuggling of a child seeking affection. This was desperate clinging, like she was trying to disappear into me completely. That's when I noticed the bruises on her upper arms. Dark purple marks, finger-shaped, too big to be from child's play. My blood went cold as winter. But I kept my voice calm as I asked her how she'd gotten hurt. She looked at me with those blue eyes swimming in tears and whispered that she'd fallen down. Just fell down, she said, but wouldn't meet my gaze when she said it. Every instinct I had as a woman, as a mother, as someone who'd worked with the public long enough to recognize when people were lying, started screaming that something was wrong. But the other part of me, the part that had been conditioned by nearly 5 decades of trust and family loyalty, pushed those instincts down. Children fall, I told myself. They bruise easily. She's been having nightmares and probably thrashing around in her sleep. I managed to get her dressed and off to school, but all day at work, I couldn't shake the image of those bruises. During my lunch break, I called Dr. Henderson's office and made an appointment for that afternoon, telling his nurse that Willa had been having some sleeping troubles and I wanted to rule out any physical causes. Dr. Henderson had been our family physician for 20 years. He delivered half the babies in Havenwood and had a gentle way with children that put even the most nervous parents at ease. When I brought Willa in that afternoon, he examined her thoroughly while I sat in the corner chair, my hands twisted together so tight my knuckles had gone white. What he found made my world tilt sideways. Not just the bruises I'd seen, but others, older ones, fading yellow and green marks on her back and thighs. Evidence of recurring urinary tract infections. Physical signs that no 7-year-old should have. Signs that spoke of things I couldn't even let myself think about fully. Dr. Henderson's face had gone grave as stone. He asked Willa some gentle questions while she sat on the examination table, her legs dangling like she didn't have a care in the world. She answered in that bright, cheerful voice children use when they're trying to convince adults that everything's fine. But her answers didn't add up. Falls in the backyard that happened at night. Games with Grandpa and Grandma that were just for big people. Secret things that she wasn't supposed to talk about because it would make everyone sad. When Dr. Henderson asked me to step out into the hallway with him, I knew my life was about to change forever. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, making everything look harsh and unforgiving as he spoke words that shattered every assumption I'd ever made about my family, my home, my ability to protect the most important person in my world. I stood there in that sterile hallway, listening to a man I trusted tell me that my granddaughter was being sexually abused, and feeling like someone had reached into my chest and torn my heart clean out. The worst part wasn't just the horror of what was happening to her. It was the dawning realization that it had been happening under my own roof, probably for months, while I went to work every day thinking she was safe with the people who were supposed to love her most. That night, I sat in my car in the driveway for almost an hour, staring at the warm yellow lights in the windows of my house, watching the shadows of my parents moving around inside. From the outside, we still looked like a normal family, but now I knew better. Now I knew that monsters don't always hide under the bed or in dark alleys. Sometimes they sit at your dinner table and say grace before they destroy everything good in your world. I realized that night that there was no going back to the woman I'd been that morning. That woman had been naive, trusting, blissfully ignorant of the evil that had taken root in her own home. The woman sitting in that driveway was someone different, someone who was going to have to make choices she'd never imagined making, someone who was going to have to find strength she didn't know she possessed. Because protecting Willa wasn't just about confronting my parents anymore. It was about confronting the possibility that everything I'd believed about right and wrong, about family and loyalty, about the very foundations of my world, had been built on lies. That evening, after I'd tucked Willa into bed and listened to her say her prayers, hearing her ask God to bless Grandpa and Grandma with the same sweet innocence she'd always had, I knew I couldn't wait another day. The knowledge Dr. Henderson had given me was burning in my chest like acid, eating away at everything I thought I knew about my life. I found my parents in the living room, same as every night for the past 3 years. Daddy in his recliner with the evening paper, Mama on the sofa with her knitting needles clicking away at what looked like a baby blanket for someone at church, the picture of elderly contentment, 2 people who'd earned their peaceful twilight years through a lifetime of hard work and devotion. But now, when I looked at them, all I could see were those finger-shaped bruises on Willa's arms. All I could hear was Dr. Henderson's gentle voice explaining things that made my stomach turn inside out. My hands were shaking so bad I had to clasp them behind my back as I stood in the doorway. My voice came out smaller than I intended when I asked if we could talk. Daddy looked up from his paper with those same kind eyes that had comforted me through childhood scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. Mama set down her knitting and patted the sofa beside her, inviting me to sit like she had 1,000 times before. I couldn't sit, couldn't pretend this was just another family conversation. Instead, I stood there and told them what Dr. Henderson had found, watched their faces as I described the bruises, the infections, the physical evidence that someone had been hurting my baby girl. The transformation was like watching angels turn into demons right before my eyes. The kindness drained out of Daddy's face, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before. Mama's mouth twisted into a sneer that made her look like a complete stranger, her voice taking on a tone I didn't recognize when she started talking. They called me paranoid, said I was seeing things that weren't there because I was stressed about Birdie, because I was getting older, and women my age sometimes got strange ideas in their heads. They suggested maybe I was the one who'd hurt Willa during one of my episodes. What episodes, I asked, but they just looked at each other like they shared some secret knowledge about my mental state. But the worst part was when they started talking about Willa herself. Called her a liar, a troubled child who made up stories for attention. Said she was probably acting out because of her mama's problems, trying to get sympathy by making up wild tales about the people who loved her most. Daddy's voice got harder when he said some children were just born with something wrong in their heads, something that made them twist innocent affection into ugly stories. I watched these people, my parents, the ones who'd raised me to tell the truth and stand up for what was right, systematically tear down a 7-year-old child's credibility like they'd had practice at it. Like this wasn't the first time they'd had to defend themselves against accusations that should have horrified any normal grandparent. Then came the threats. Not loud or violent, but quiet and matter-of-fact, which somehow made them even more terrifying. They reminded me whose house I was living in, whose name was on the deed. They talked about how it would look if I took a child away from loving grandparents based on the fantasies of an unstable single mother with a drug-addicted daughter. Who would believe me, they asked, against their spotless reputation in the community? They painted a picture of what would happen if I pushed this further. Child services would take Willa away from all of us. She'd end up in foster care with strangers while I'd be investigated for being an unfit guardian. Birdie would lose any chance of getting her daughter back when she got clean. Our whole family would be destroyed by gossip and suspicion, all because I'd chosen to believe the made-up stories of a confused little girl over the people who devoted their lives to taking care of her. The horrible thing was, they weren't wrong about how it would look. This was 2004, in a small Kansas town where my parents had been respected members of the community for 40 years. I was a single woman with a troubled daughter and no husband to back me up. It would be my word against theirs, and they'd built themselves quite a reputation for righteousness over the decades. As they talked, I realized they'd thought this through already, had contingency plans for what to do if their secret ever came out. They knew exactly what buttons to push to make me doubt myself, to make me wonder if I was losing my mind, to make me afraid of the consequences of speaking up. But even as they talked, even as they tried to convince me I was crazy, I could see something in their eyes that hadn't been there before. A wariness, a calculation, like they were deciding how much of a threat I really was. It was the look predators get when their hunting ground is threatened, when they're deciding whether to retreat or attack. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of my childhood home settling around me. But nothing felt familiar anymore. I was living with strangers who wore my parents' faces, sleeping under the same roof as people who were hurting my granddaughter and planning to continue hurting her as long as they could get away with it. I realized that this was what true helplessness felt like. Not the everyday frustrations of life, but the soul-crushing knowledge that the system designed to protect children would probably fail this one because the people hurting her had spent decades building the perfect cover story. And somewhere in that dark bedroom, with my parents' voices still echoing in my head and the image of Willa's bruised arms burned behind my eyelids, I began to understand that conventional solutions weren't going to work, that sometimes love demands choices that look like evil to everyone else, but feel like the only path toward salvation. The days that followed our confrontation felt like living in a house made of glass that could shatter at any moment. My parents didn't bring up our conversation again, but everything had changed. They watched me now, studying my every move like I was a puzzle they needed to solve. When I'd come home from work, I'd catch them whispering in the kitchen, conversations that stopped the moment I walked through the door. Daddy started making comments about my mental state. Little observations dropped into casual conversation like poison in sweet tea. How I seemed tired lately, stressed, maybe not thinking as clearly as I used to. Mama would agree with that concerned tone mothers use when they're worried about their children, suggesting maybe I should see someone, talk to somebody about the pressure I was under with Bertie's problems and all. But the worst part was watching what they were doing to Willa. They'd gotten more careful, more subtle, but I could see the fear in her eyes growing deeper every day. She stopped eating much at dinner, just pushing food around on her plate while they made pleasant conversation about her school day. When they'd offer to help her with her bath or tuck her into bed, she'd look at me with those pleading blue eyes. But what could I say? What could I do that wouldn't make everything worse? I'd started sleeping with my bedroom door open, straining to hear every creak and footstep in the old house. More than once, I'd gotten up in the middle of the night and found Daddy's recliner empty, his bedroom door closed, but no sound of his familiar snoring coming from within. I'd check on Willa and find her wide awake, staring at the ceiling. But when I'd ask if everything was okay, she'd just nod and close her eyes tight, pretending to sleep. 3 weeks after my conversation with Dr. Henderson, I made the hardest phone call of my life. I dialed the number for Child Protective Services, my hands shaking so bad I had to redial twice. When the caseworker answered, I tried to explain the situation, tried to make her understand that a child was in danger and needed help immediately. Her name was Mrs. Crawford, and she had that tired, overworked sound that people get when they've heard too many horrible stories and stopped being surprised by human cruelty. She took down my information, asked me questions about the physical evidence, about what Willa had told me directly. When I admitted that my granddaughter hadn't actually said the words about what was happening to her, just hinted around the edges with talk of games and secrets, I could hear the change in Mrs. Crawford's voice. She explained the process to me like she'd done it 1,000 times before. They'd schedule a home visit, interview all the adults in the household, talk to Willa at school where she might feel safer to speak freely. It could take weeks to complete their investigation, and in the meantime, Willa would remain in the home unless there was immediate physical danger that could be documented. I hung up that phone knowing I'd just lit a fuse that was going to blow up my family, but not knowing if it would save Willa or make her situation worse. Because if CPS couldn't prove anything, and given my parents' reputation and their careful denials, that seemed likely, then I'd be living in the same house with two people who now knew I was actively trying to expose them. The home visit came on a Thursday afternoon. Mrs. Crawford was a middle-aged black woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that gave me hope she'd see through my parents' performance. But I watched them work their magic on her. Watched Daddy charm her with his stories about working at the grain elevator and Mama offer her fresh coffee and homemade cookies like they were entertaining a welcomed guest instead of a government investigator. They showed her through the house, pointing out the toys they'd bought for Willa, the little desk where she did her homework, the framed pictures of family gatherings that told the story of a loving, multi-generational household. When Mrs. Crawford asked about the bruises Dr. Henderson had documented, they had explanations ready. Willa was an active child who loved to climb trees and play rough. She'd always been accident-prone, they said with fond smiles, showing pictures of her with scraped knees and bandaged elbows from various childhood adventures. When it came time to interview Willa, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. This was our chance, our one shot at getting help from the system designed to protect children like her. Mrs. Crawford took her into the living room alone while the rest of us waited in the kitchen, the silence so thick you could cut it with a knife. 20 minutes later they emerged, and I could tell from Mrs. Crawford's expression that we'd lost. Willa looked smaller somehow, more fragile, and she wouldn't meet my eyes as she went straight to her room. Mrs. Crawford spent a few more minutes with my parents, going through formalities and paperwork, before packing up her briefcase and heading for the door. I followed her outside, desperate for some sign that she'd seen what I was seeing, that she understood the danger my granddaughter was in. But she just shook her head and told me that children sometimes act out when there's instability in the home, that Willa seemed well cared for and showed no signs of current abuse. She suggested family counseling, maybe some therapy for Willa to help her adjust to her mother's absence. That night at dinner, my parents were positively glowing with satisfaction. They'd passed their test, proven their innocence to the authorities, and now they had even more ammunition to use against me if I tried to make trouble again. Daddy mentioned how nice Mrs. Crawford had been, how she'd commented on what a loving home we provided for Willa. Mama agreed, adding that it was good to have professionals confirm what they'd always known, that our family was strong and healthy despite the challenges we'd faced. I sat there pushing food around on my plate, watching Willa do the same, and realized that I'd just learned a terrible lesson about how the system really works. Good reputations and pleasant facades carry more weight than physical evidence and a child's suffering. The very respectability that made my parents effective predators also made them untouchable by the people whose job it was to protect their victims. But what scared me most was the look I caught passing between my parents when they thought I wasn't watching. It was a look of triumph, yes, but also something darker. Something that told me they now saw me as more than just a problem to be managed. They saw me as an enemy who'd already proven she was willing to bring outside forces into their carefully constructed world. And I was beginning to understand that enemies, in their minds, needed to be eliminated. The weeks after the CPS visit were like living in a war zone where all the battles were fought with smiles and politeness. My parents had won the first skirmish, and they wanted me to know it. They started making changes to our daily routine that felt innocent on the surface, but cut me off from Willa in subtle ways. Mama suddenly decided she needed to walk Willa to and from school every day, claiming the exercise was good for her arthritis. When I protested that I'd been handling the school runs just fine, she gave me that patient smile she'd perfected over 7 decades and said it was the least she could do to help out, seeing as how stressed I'd been lately. The way she said stressed made it sound like a diagnosis, like something that made me unreliable. Daddy started insisting on helping Willa with her homework at the kitchen table right after dinner, saying his old teacher's training was finally coming in handy. Never mind that he'd worked at the grain elevator his whole career and had never taught anything to anyone. But he'd sit there with her for hours, their heads bent together over her workbooks. And every time I tried to join them or check on their progress, he'd wave me away with a cheerful comment about too many cooks spoiling the broth. They were systematically cutting me out of Willa's daily life and doing it in ways that made me look like the unreasonable one if I objected. When I tried to give Willa her bath one evening, Mama appeared in the hallway and gently reminded me that little girls needed privacy at her age, that it was more appropriate for another woman to help her with such personal things. The implication being that somehow my presence was inappropriate, while hers was natural and proper. I started staying awake later and later, listening for sounds in the night, trying to protect my granddaughter in the only way I had left. But exhaustion was making me sloppy, making me emotional in ways they could use against me. I'd snap at them over trivial things. The way Daddy cleared his throat constantly, or how Mama hummed the same hymn over and over while she cooked. And they'd exchange those concerned looks that said more than words ever could about my deteriorating mental state. The isolation was the worst part. In a town like Havenwood, word travels fast, and somehow people had started hearing that there'd been some kind of investigation at our house. Not the details, mind you, but enough to make neighbors start treating me differently. The whispers would stop when I walked into Miller's grocery, and old friends from church would give me those sympathetic smiles people reserve for families going through unnamed troubles. My parents were masterful at managing the narrative. They'd mention to people how worried they were about me, how the stress of Bertie's addiction and single motherhood had finally caught up with me. They'd talk about finding me confused sometimes, forgetful, maybe showing early signs of whatever had claimed my grandmother's mind in her final years. Always said with such love and concern that no one would ever question their motives, but I knew what I was seeing at home. The way Willa flinched when Daddy reached for her, even in innocent moments. How she'd developed this habit of checking to make sure I was nearby before she'd relax, like she was constantly calculating escape routes. The dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. And the way she'd started talking to her dolls in whispers, playing out scenarios that made my blood run cold when I caught fragments of the conversations. One evening in early November, when the first frost had painted the windows and the house felt colder than it should have despite the furnace running full blast, I found something that confirmed my worst fears. I'd been putting away Willa's laundry when I discovered a small notebook hidden under her mattress, the kind with cartoon animals on the cover that 7-year-olds use to practice their letters. The pages were filled with her careful printing, spelling mistakes and all, but the content was nothing a child should know how to write about. She'd been documenting the games, describing things that made me sick to read, drawing pictures with her colored pencils that showed stick figures in positions that stole the breath right out of my lungs. At the bottom of one page, in her careful first-grade handwriting, she'd written, "I am bad, and that's why it happens. Mama left because I am bad." I sat on her bedroom floor, holding that notebook with hands that couldn't stop shaking, and realized that my parents hadn't just been abusing her body. They'd been destroying her soul. They'd convinced this precious child that she was somehow responsible for what they were doing to her, that her mother's absence was punishment for her imagined sins. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I called Dr. Henderson's emergency line. When he answered, sounding groggy but concerned, I told him about the notebook, read him some of the entries that weren't too graphic to say out loud. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone before he spoke, his voice heavy with something that might have been defeat. He told me he'd suspected as much after our last visit, but without the child's direct testimony or catching the abuse in progress, there was little anyone could do. The notebook might be evidence, he said, but it could also be explained away as the fantasies of a troubled child acting out her mother's abandonment. He'd seen cases like this before, where everyone knew what was happening but couldn't prove it in ways that would hold up in court. The system, he explained gently, was designed to protect families, which often meant giving the benefit of the doubt to parents and guardians who seemed respectable on the surface. My parents' sterling reputation in the community, combined with their age and apparent frailty, made them unlikely suspects in most people's minds. Who would believe that two elderly churchgoers were capable of such horrors? But then Dr. Henderson said something that changed everything. He told me about a case he'd handled early in his career, another child in a similar situation whose family had seemed above reproach. He'd followed protocol, documented everything properly, worked within the system just like he was supposed to. The child had remained in the home while investigations dragged on, and one morning they'd found her dead in her bed. Officially ruled a suicide, But she was only 9 years old. The regret in his voice when he told me that story cut through me like a blade. He said he'd learned that sometimes the system fails, and when it does, the people who love these children have to decide whether following the rules is more important than saving a life. After I hung up the phone, I sat in the dark kitchen of my childhood home, surrounded by the familiar smells of coffee and vanilla extract and the lingering scent of Mama's rose-scented hand lotion. Everything looked the same as it had for decades, but I was seeing it all differently now. This wasn't a safe haven anymore. It was a prison where a 7-year-old was serving a sentence for crimes she hadn't committed, and I was beginning to understand that if I wanted to save her, I was going to have to become someone I'd never imagined being. Someone who could do things that went against everything I'd been taught about right and wrong, about respecting your elders and following the law and turning the other cheek. Because sometimes love doesn't look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like something the world would call unforgivable. Winter settled over Havenwood like a shroud that year, bringing with it the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and won't let go. The house felt smaller with everyone trapped inside by the weather, and the tension that had been building for months was reaching a breaking point. Every room held the weight of unspoken truths. Every meal was seasoned with silent accusations, and every night brought fresh horrors I was powerless to prevent. By December, Willa had stopped speaking unless directly asked a question, and even then her answers came in whispers that barely disturbed the air. She moved through the house like a ghost, clinging to the shadows and avoiding eye contact with everyone, including me. The light that had once made her my little ray of sunshine was fading more each day, and I could see in her hollow stare the same look I'd seen in animals caught in traps, a kind of hopeless acceptance that this was simply how life was going to be. The notebook I'd found had disappeared from under her mattress within days of my discovery. When I'd asked her about it, she'd looked at me with those 2 old eyes and said she'd thrown it away because it was full of lies. The way she said it, so flat and rehearsed, told me exactly who had convinced her to destroy the one piece of evidence that might have saved her. My parents had grown bolder in their manipulation, more confident in their ability to control the situation. They started making comments about how maybe it would be better if I found my own place, how the stress of living with family might be affecting my judgment. Nothing direct, mind you, just gentle suggestions that perhaps some distance would help me get my head on straight. The message was clear: step back and let them have unfettered access to Willa, or face the consequences of continued resistance. But it was what happened on a Tuesday night in mid-December that finally broke something inside me that I don't think will ever heal properly. I'd been lying in bed, straining to hear every sound in the house, as had become my habit, when I heard Willa's door creak open. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, trying to be quiet, but unable to completely silence the protests of our old wooden floors. I got up and crept to my bedroom door, peering through the crack to see Daddy's silhouette moving down the hallway toward the living room. In his arms was Willa, and even in the dim light filtering through the windows, I could see she was awake but completely limp, like a rag doll being carried to some terrible fate. Every instinct screamed at me to burst out of my room, to stop whatever was about to happen, to finally confront this horror head-on. But I also knew that if I did, it would be his word against mine again, and he'd already proven how skilled he was at making me look like the unstable one. Instead, I did something that still haunts me. I followed them. Moving as quietly as I could, I made my way to the living room doorway and positioned myself where I could see but hopefully remain hidden in the shadows. What I witnessed there in the soft glow of the streetlight coming through our front windows was a scene that burned itself into my memory so completely that even now, all these years later, I can recall every horrible detail with perfect clarity. I watched my father, the man who'd taught me to ride a bicycle and walked me down the aisle at my wedding rehearsal when Tommy never came home from Vietnam, do things to my granddaughter that no child should ever endure. I saw with my own eyes the methodical way he went about his evil, the practiced movements that told me this had been happening for far longer than I'd ever imagined. But worse than witnessing the physical abuse was seeing Willa's face during it all. She didn't cry or struggle or make any sound at all. She just stared up at the ceiling with that same empty expression she'd been wearing for weeks, like her spirit had already fled to someplace safe while her body endured what it had to endure. She'd learned to disappear inside herself, the way children do when their reality becomes too horrible to fully experience. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen between the need to act and the paralyzing certainty that any action I took would only make things worse for her in the long run. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, before Daddy finished his business and carried her back to her room with the same careful quiet he'd used to take her. I made it back to my own bed just as I heard him settling into his recliner, his alibi, I realized, the place he'd be sleeping if anyone came looking for him in the night. The sound of his fake snoring started up almost immediately, a performance for anyone who might be listening, proof that he'd been in the living room all along, just an old man who'd fallen asleep in his chair watching late-night television. I lay in my bed for the rest of that night, staring at the ceiling and feeling like something fundamental had broken inside me. Not just my heart or my faith in humanity, but something deeper. My ability to keep pretending that there might be a solution that didn't require me to cross lines I'd never imagined crossing. Because I'd finally understood something that changed everything. This wasn't going to stop. My parents weren't going to suddenly develop consciences and cease their abuse. The system wasn't going to swoop in and save Willa, despite all evidence pointing to her need for rescue. And every day I continued to live under the same roof as these monsters. I was becoming complicit in their crimes through my inaction. The next morning at breakfast, I watched Mama fuss over Willa's appearance, smoothing her hair and adjusting her school clothes with those same hands that had probably helped hold her down the night before. I watched Daddy ruffle her hair and call her his little sunshine with the same mouth that had whispered horrible things to her in the darkness. And I watched Willa sit there, silent and small, mechanically eating her cereal while the people destroying her soul played their roles as loving grandparents. That's when I realized that evil doesn't always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it comes dressed as respectability, hiding behind church attendance and community service and 40 years of building a reputation that makes it untouchable. Sometimes it sits at your breakfast table, saying grace before meals and asking about homework assignments, all while planning the next assault on innocence. And sometimes, when all legal and moral avenues have been exhausted, love has to put on the mask of something terrible to protect what matters most. Sometimes the only way to save an angel is to become the devil in someone else's story. I was beginning to understand that I had a choice to make, and it wasn't between right and wrong anymore. It was between which kind of wrong I could live with. The wrong of letting this continue, or the wrong of making sure it stopped forever, no matter what that meant for me personally. Because watching my granddaughter disappear a little more each day was killing me slower than any punishment the law could devise. The revelation that shattered what little hope I had left came from the most unexpected source. Willa herself, in a moment of innocence that revealed the true depth of her torment. It was 3 days before Christmas, and I'd been trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy by taking her shopping for a few small presents. We'd driven to the Walmart in the next town over, where nobody would recognize us and ask uncomfortable questions about why I looked like I hadn't slept in weeks. We were walking through the toy aisle, and I was watching her face, hoping to see some spark of childhood wonder return as she looked at the dolls and games. But she moved through it all like she was sleepwalking, touching nothing, showing interest in nothing, until we passed a display of baby dolls near the end of the aisle. She stopped suddenly and picked up one of the dolls, cradling it against her chest with a tenderness that broke my heart. For a moment, she looked like the little girl she was supposed to be, and I felt a flutter of hope that maybe some part of her spirit was still intact. But then she started talking to the doll in that whisper voice she'd developed, and the words that came out of her mouth made my knees go weak. She was telling the baby doll about the games, describing in her innocent 7-year-old vocabulary things that no child should know about. But it wasn't the content that destroyed me. It was the tone. She was talking to that doll like a mother preparing her child for what was to come, passing down knowledge that had been passed to her, warning the baby about what grown-ups sometimes did and how you had to be very quiet and very still until it was over. Standing there in the bright fluorescent lights of that store, surrounded by Christmas decorations and holiday shoppers, I listened to my granddaughter preparing an imaginary baby for abuse, like it was just another fact of life that children needed to learn. Like tying shoes or saying please and thank you. Just one more skill required for survival in a world where the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones you needed protection from. When she finished her whispered instructions to the doll, she looked up at me with those hollow blue eyes and said something that still echoes in my nightmares. She asked me if I thought her mama had played the same games when she was little, and if that's why she'd gotten sick and had to go away. She wondered out loud if maybe when she got older, she'd get sick too, and have to leave her own babies someday. I managed to keep my composure until we got back to the car, but once I'd buckled her into her booster seat and closed the door, I fell apart completely. I stood there in that parking lot, holding on to the car door and sobbing like my heart was being torn out. Because I'd finally understood the full scope of what my parents had done. They hadn't just stolen her childhood. They'd poisoned her understanding of what family meant, what love looked like, what kind of future she could expect. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept looking in the rearview mirror at Willa, who'd fallen asleep against the window, and I could see her mother in the curve of her cheek, the way her hair fell across her forehead. And I started thinking about Birdie, really thinking about her for the first time in years, wondering if her addiction wasn't just weakness or bad choices, but an attempt to numb pain that went back further than I'd ever imagined. Had my parents done this to Birdie too? Had I been so naive, so trusting, that I'd missed the signs when my own daughter was suffering? The timing made horrible sense. Birdie's problems had started in adolescence, right around the age when children become too old for some predators but perfect victims for others. The way she'd pulled away from family gatherings, the nightmares she'd had as a teenager that I'd dismissed as typical drama, the desperate way she'd clung to boyfriends who treated her badly. It all started to form a pattern I should have recognized years ago. That night, after my parents had gone to bed and the house had settled into its familiar creaks and sighs, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable to the woman I'd been 6 months earlier. I went to the kitchen and pulled out the step stool Mama used to reach the high shelves, climbed up, and retrieved something I hadn't touched in over a decade, Daddy's old service revolver from his brief stint in the National Guard. It was still in its box, wrapped in the same oilcloth he'd used to preserve it, along with a handful of bullets that looked as deadly as the day they'd been manufactured. I sat at the kitchen table, holding that cold metal in my hands, and tried to reconcile the woman who'd never hurt a fly with what I was contemplating. But every time doubt crept in, I'd remember the sound of Willa's voice in that toy aisle, preparing an imaginary baby for horrors that should never exist. I'd think about the emptiness in her eyes, the way she'd learned to disappear inside herself, the future of pain and confusion that stretched ahead of her if nothing changed. I thought about all the official channels I'd tried, all the proper procedures that had failed her. I thought about Dr. Henderson's story of the 9-year-old who died waiting for the system to save her. I thought about how my parents would continue their abuse, would probably escalate it now that they knew I was onto them, and how eventually they'd convince everyone that I was the problem, the unstable one who needed to be removed from Willa's life entirely. The hardest part wasn't imagining pulling the trigger. It was accepting that this was the only choice left that guaranteed Willa's safety. Every other option left room for my parents to continue their evil, to find new ways to hurt her, to destroy whatever pieces of her soul they hadn't already claimed. I sat in that kitchen until the sun started to rise, holding that gun and praying to a God I wasn't sure would forgive me for what I was planning to do. I asked him to show me another way, to send me a sign that there was some solution I hadn't considered. But the only answer I got was the sound of Willa waking up from another nightmare, her small voice calling for me in the darkness. When I went to comfort her, I found her sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face, looking at me with an expression that was far too old for her 7 years. She asked me why I let them hurt her, why I didn't make them stop, why nobody seemed to care that she was in pain. And that's when I knew that prayer had been answered, just not in the way I'd hoped. The sign I'd been looking for was in my granddaughter's tear-stained face, in her plea for someone, anyone, to finally put her safety above everything else. Sometimes love looks like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like choosing to carry an unbearable burden so someone else doesn't have to. And sometimes, When all other options have been exhausted and innocence hangs in the balance, love looks like becoming the monster in someone else's story, so the real monsters can never hurt another child. I kissed Willa's forehead and told her that everything was going to be different very soon, that she didn't need to be afraid much longer, that someone who loved her was going to make sure she was safe. I just didn't tell her that the someone was me, and that making her safe was going to cost me everything I had left to give. The night I chose to act was January 15th, 2005. I remember the date so clearly because it was exactly 1 week after Willa's 8th birthday, a birthday that had been celebrated with cake and presents, and the kind of forced family joy that makes your skin crawl when you know what's really happening behind closed doors. I'd been planning for 3 weeks, not the details of violence, but the practical things that would matter afterward. I'd written letters, one to Bertie explaining everything, one to Dr. Henderson asking him to make sure Willa got the help she'd need, and one to the police that laid out the whole truth about what had been happening in our house. I'd hidden these letters in different places where they'd eventually be found, insurance policies to make sure the real story came out, even if I couldn't tell it myself. The weather that night was brutal, even by Kansas standards. Ice had been falling for hours, coating everything in a crystalline shell that made the world look beautiful and deadly at the same time. The kind of night when sensible people stayed inside, when the sounds from neighboring houses were muffled by the storm, when a person could do what needed doing without worrying about witnesses. I'd waited until I was certain my parents were in their deepest sleep. Daddy had taken his blood pressure medication, which always made him drowsy, and Mama had had her nightly glass of wine with dinner, a habit she'd developed in recent years that I'd never questioned until now. Looking back, I wonder if she needed that wine to quiet whatever conscience she had left, to dull the edges of guilt that might have kept a normal person awake at night. Willa was sleeping fitfully in her room, and I'd checked on her twice before midnight, smoothing her hair and whispering promises I hoped I could keep. She'd been having the nightmares again, waking up screaming about monsters that only she could see. But I knew the monsters were real, and they were sleeping just down the hall from her. At 2:17 a.m., I know the exact time because I'd been watching the clock on the kitchen stove, I made my final walk through the house. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like thunder in my ears. Every settling noise made me freeze and wait to see if I'd woken someone. But the house remained quiet, except for the familiar sounds of my parents' sleep. Standing outside their bedroom door, I could hear Daddy's labored breathing, the slight wheeze he'd developed since his stroke, and Mama's softer sighs. These were the same sounds that had comforted me as a child when I'd wake from my own nightmares and need reassurance that the adults were nearby, keeping me safe. Now those same sounds filled me with a rage so pure it felt like swallowing fire. I pushed open their door, and in the dim light from the street lamp outside, I could see them lying there, looking like any other elderly couple. Mama was curled on her side, her gray hair spread across the pillowcase like spun silver. Daddy was on his back, mouth slightly open, one hand resting on his chest. They looked vulnerable, harmless, like the loving grandparents everyone in town believed them to be. But I'd seen what those hands had done to my granddaughter. I'd heard the lies that mouth had spoken to destroy a child's understanding of love and safety. And I knew that if I walked away now, if I let squeamishness or second thoughts stop me, Willa would pay the price for my weakness for the rest of her life. The gun felt heavier than it should have as I raised it, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip it with both fists to keep it steady. I'd never shot anything before, never even held a weapon with the intent to use it, but desperation has a way of teaching you things you never thought you'd need to know. Daddy went first. One shot to the head while he slept, quick and merciful in a way he'd never been to Willa. He never woke up, never knew what was happening, never felt the fear that his granddaughter had lived with for months. Mama stirred at the sound but didn't fully wake until I was standing over her side of the bed. For just a moment, our eyes met in the darkness, and I saw something there that might have been recognition, not just of what was happening, but of why it was happening. Maybe she'd always known this moment would come eventually, that someone would finally hold them accountable for what they'd done. Or maybe that was just my imagination, trying to find meaning in chaos. She opened her mouth. Whether to scream or plead, I'll never know. but I didn't let her finish whatever she was going to say. One more shot, and then silence fell over the house like a blanket. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, looking at what I'd done, waiting to feel something that would tell me if I'd made the right choice. Horror, regret, relief, satisfaction. Anything that would help me understand what kind of person I'd become in those few seconds. But there was nothing. Just a strange numbness that felt like being wrapped in cotton. The sound of Willa's voice calling from her room broke through my trance. She'd woken from another nightmare, and she was calling for me the way she had every night for months, needing comfort from the only person in the house she trusted. I set the gun on the dresser and went to her, because no matter what I'd just done, she still needed someone to hold her and tell her the monsters were gone. When I reached her doorway, she was sitting up in bed, her hair messed from sleep, looking at me with those blue eyes that had seen too much. She didn't ask about the sounds she must have heard, didn't question why I was fully dressed at 3 a.m. She just held out her arms the way children do when they need to be held, and I went to her. As I gathered her against my chest, breathing in the sweet smell of her shampoo and feeling her small heart beating against mine, I realized that I felt something after all. Not regret or horror, but a kind of peace I hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I knew with absolute certainty that Willa was safe. The monsters were dead, and they would never hurt another child again. I spent those final hours before dawn holding Willa close, memorizing the weight of her in my arms, the sound of her breathing as she finally slept peacefully for the first time in months. I knew it would be the last time I'd ever hold her like this, the last quiet moment we'd share before the world came crashing in to tear us apart forever. When the sun started filtering through her bedroom curtains, painting everything in soft gold light, I gently woke her up and helped her get dressed for what I told her was going to be a very important day. She was unusually calm, almost serene, as if some part of her child's intuition understood that whatever had been haunting her nights was finally gone. I made her breakfast, pancakes with extra syrup, the way she liked them, and we sat at the kitchen table together while I explained that some people were going to come to the house today and that they might take me away for a while. She listened with that solemn attention children give to conversations they don't fully understand, but know are important. When I asked her if she remembered the games that Grandpa and Grandma used to play with her, her whole body went still. But instead of the usual fear that would cloud her eyes, she just nodded and said something that nearly broke my heart. She asked if that meant the bad games were over now, forever and always. I told her yes, they were over, and that no one would ever hurt her like that again. The smile that spread across her face was like watching the sun come out after the longest winter. Pure joy mixed with relief so profound it made her whole body relax for the first time in months. At 8:30 that morning, I called 911 and told them what I'd done. The dispatcher tried to keep me on the line, asking questions about weapons and whether anyone else was in danger, but I just gave them our address and hung up. Then I sat with Willa on the front porch swing, wrapped in one of Mama's quilts, waiting for my old life to end and her new one to begin. The police arrived first, followed by paramedics, then what seemed like half the town once word started spreading. I watched our neighbors gather across the street, some crying, some pointing, all trying to make sense of how quiet Clementine Foster could have done such a terrible thing to two of Havenwood's most respected citizens. But the twist that changed everything came when they found my letters. Detective Morrison, a man I'd known since he was in high school, discovered them exactly where I'd hidden them. And as he read through the documentation I'd carefully prepared, I watched his expression change from confusion to horror to something that might have been understanding. Within hours, they'd found more evidence than I'd even known existed. My parents had been more careless than they'd realized, keeping twisted souvenirs of their crimes hidden in places they thought no one would ever look. Photographs, recordings, journals that documented not just what they'd done to Willa, but to other children over the years, including my own daughter, Birdie. The investigation revealed that my parents had been predators for decades, using their position in the community and their reputation as godly people to gain access to vulnerable children. Birdie hadn't been their first victim, and Willa wouldn't have been there last. The drugs that destroyed my daughter's life weren't moral weakness or bad choices. They were her attempt to survive trauma that no child should ever endure. But the biggest revelation came when they searched the old coal cellar beneath our house. Hidden behind a false wall, they found evidence of other children who'd disappeared over the years from neighboring towns, children whose families had never stopped wondering what happened to their babies. The scope of my parents' evil was so vast that it took months for investigators to piece together the full extent of their crimes. Standing in that courtroom when the evidence was presented, listening to the prosecutor describe my parents not as victims, but as monsters who'd finally been stopped, I felt something I hadn't expected. Vindication. Not joy. There's no joy in any of this. But the deep satisfaction of knowing that I'd been right to trust my instincts. Right to protect my granddaughter when no one else would. The judge, an elderly man who'd known my family for years, looked at me with something I'd never seen in anyone's eyes when they talked about my case. Respect. He said that while he couldn't condone vigilante justice, he understood that sometimes the system fails the most vulnerable among us, and that my actions, however extreme, had undoubtedly saved lives. I was sentenced to 20 years, and I served every day of it without complaint. But here's what nobody expected, what even I didn't see coming. Those 20 years weren't punishment. They were healing. Away from the scene of so much trauma, away from the whispers and judgments of people who'd never faced an impossible choice, I found a peace I'd never known existed. Willa grew up safe, surrounded by people who loved her and helped her process what had happened to her. Birdie got clean and became the mother she was always meant to be, finally understanding that her addiction wasn't her fault. They visited me regularly, and I watched my granddaughter transform from a hollow-eyed ghost into a vibrant young woman who knew her own worth. Now at 69, I'm living in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, getting reacquainted with a world that's changed dramatically while I was away. Willa is 27 now, married to a good man who treats her like she's precious, expecting her first baby in the spring. She still calls me her hero, says I saved her life in the only way that mattered. People ask me if I have any regrets, if I wish I'd found another way. The truth is, I've spent 20 years thinking about that question, and my answer never changes. I regret that it came to that, but I don't regret what I did. Some battles can only be won by people willing to sacrifice everything for love. I learned that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like your neighbors, your family members, the people everyone trusts most. And I learned that heroes don't always look like heroes either. Sometimes we look like grandmothers with shaking hands and hearts full of desperate love. My story isn't one you'll see in movies or read in fairy tales. It's messy and complicated and doesn't have the kind of ending that makes everyone feel good about the world. But it's real and it's mine. And most importantly, it's a story that ends with a child being safe. If you're listening to this, and you know a child who needs protecting, don't wait for someone else to act. Don't trust that the system will save them in time. Sometimes love requires us to become the person we never thought we could be, to make choices that will haunt us forever, but save someone who matters more than our own comfort. I'm sharing this story not for sympathy or understanding, but so other children don't have to wait as long as Willa did for someone to believe them, someone to act, someone to put their safety above everything else. Because every child deserves to sleep without nightmares, to trust that the adults in their lives will protect them from the monsters, even when those monsters wear familiar faces. If my words have reached you, wherever you are, I hope you'll help them travel further. Share this story with people who need to hear it, because sometimes the most important truths are the ones that make us uncomfortable. I'm still here, still telling the truth after all these years, and I want to know, what city are you listening from? I'd love to know where my words are finding their way. And if this old woman's story has moved you, if it's made you think differently about what love sometimes demands, then maybe you'll help me continue this work. Subscribe to hear more stories like mine, stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when it mattered most. Because the world is full of children who need champions, and champions come in all forms, even grandmothers who learned that sometimes salvation looks like sin to everyone else.